Did you know that Japanese prisoners of war in America initially refused to eat chocolate, declaring it a disgusting Western perversion that insulted their refined palates? They viewed American sweets as evidence of cultural inferiority, soft indulgence from a soft people. Some threw chocolate bars into the garbage unopened. Others smashed them underfoot in symbolic rejection. But within weeks, these same men were trading cigarettes for extra chocolate rations, hiding candy bars in their bunks, and writing home-asking families to send them cocoa powder if they could find any in devastated post-war Japan. This is the story of how a simple Hershey bar became the catalyst for a profound psychological transformation, how sweetness cracked through decades of militaristic conditioning, and how Japanese POWs discovered that everything they'd been taught about American weakness was a lie wrapped in foil. The story begins in the autumn of 1945, in the chaotic months following Japan's surrender. Unlike German and Italian prisoners who'd been captured throughout the war and housed in American camps for years, most Japanese POWs came to America only after the atomic bombs fell, and Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over radios announcing the unthinkable: surrender. For soldiers raised in a culture that valued death over capture, who'd been taught that surrender was the ultimate disgrace, who carried cyanide capsules to avoid the shame of being taken alive, finding themselves prisoners was a psychological earthquake. Among the first groups transferred to American soil was a contingent of 500 Japanese soldiers captured in the Philippines and Okinawa. They arrived at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin in October 1945 expecting execution or, at minimum, brutal treatment befitting the propaganda they'd absorbed for years. Americans, they'd been told, were barbaric devils who tortured prisoners, who lacked honor, who represented everything corrupt and degenerate about the West. Private First Class Takeshi Yamamoto was among them. At 23, he'd spent 3 years fighting in the Pacific, from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, watching his unit shrink from 800 men to barely 50 survivors. He'd eaten grass and bark to survive when rations ran out. He'd seen friends die of starvation more often than enemy fire. He'd been prepared to die in a final banzai charge when American soldiers overran his position and took him prisoner instead. The shame of capture was overwhelming. In Japanese military culture, the greatest honor was death in service to the emperor. Surrender was worse than cowardice. It was a betrayal of everything sacred. Takeshi's training had been explicit. If capture became inevitable, you ended your life. That he was alive meant he'd failed the ultimate test. He expected nothing from his American captors except contempt and, eventually, execution. Instead, he got a medical examination, clean clothes, a bunk with actual sheets, and 3 meals a day. The first meal at Camp McCoy shattered his expectations. Beef stew with thick chunks of meat, white bread with butter, canned peaches, milk and coffee. Takeshi stared at the tray in disbelief. This was more food than he'd seen in months. The beef alone, real beef, not the occasional bit of fish or rice, was more protein than his entire unit had shared in a week toward the war's end. But the psychological conditioning ran deep. Takeshi's sergeant, a career soldier named Koji Sato who'd fought in China and throughout the Pacific, refused to touch his food. "This is a trick," he announced in Japanese to the assembled prisoners. "They're fattening us for something, or the food is poisoned, or they're testing our weakness. Do not eat." Others nodded in agreement, their military discipline overriding their hunger. But their bodies told a different story. Many of these men weighed 30 to 40 pounds less than healthy weights for their height. Malnutrition had left them with weakened immune systems, dental problems, and vitamin deficiencies. Their bodies were consuming themselves, muscle tissue breaking down to keep vital organs functioning. The standoff lasted 2 days. The Americans, through Japanese-speaking interpreters, many of them Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans who'd served as translators, tried to explain that the Geneva Convention required proper treatment of prisoners. The Japanese soldiers didn't believe it. Geneva Convention protections were propaganda, they'd been told. No such protections existed, and even if they did, Americans wouldn't honor them. On the 3rd day, a young soldier named Hiroshi Tanaka, barely 19, collapsed from hunger. He'd been surviving on minimal rations for months before capture, and his body simply couldn't endure further deprivation. American medics rushed him to the camp hospital, treated him, and fed him intravenously. When he recovered enough to eat solid food, they brought him rice, not American food, but rice prepared Japanese style with miso soup and pickled vegetables they'd somehow procured. This act of cultural sensitivity cracked the resistance. If the Americans were cruel devils, why would they care about Japanese food preferences? Why would they go to the effort of preparing rice properly? Hiroshi ate, gained strength, and returned to the barracks with a confession. The food is real. They're not trying to poison us. I think they actually intend to keep us alive. Slowly, reluctantly, the others began eating. Takeshi took his first bite of beef stew with the wariness of a man expecting betrayal. The meat was tender, rich, swimming in thick gravy with potatoes and carrots. He chewed slowly, waiting for the trick, the punishment, something to confirm his world view. Instead, he just tasted food. Good food. More food than he'd eaten in a single meal since before the war began. He finished the bowl, then the bread, then the peaches. His stomach, shrunken from months of near starvation, cramped with the sudden abundance, but he felt something he'd almost forgotten: satisfaction. Not just the absence of hunger, but actual fullness. His body responded with a wave of gratitude so intense it frightened him. But the real transformation began a week later, when the Americans distributed something that would become legendary among Japanese POWs: chocolate bars. Hershey's chocolate, standard issue for American troops, handed out casually to prisoners as if it were nothing special. Each man received 2 bars, small rectangles wrapped in brown paper and foil, marked with simple letters, Hershey's. Sergeant Sato held his chocolate bar like it was contaminated. He'd heard of chocolate, a Western confection made from tropical beans mixed with sugar and milk into a bar that supposedly tasted sweet. In Japan, sweets existed but were subtle. Mochi made from pounded rice, yokan made from sweet bean paste, modest confections that complemented tea ceremonies. Western chocolate, he'd been told, was excessive, cloying, evidence of American overindulgence and lack of refinement. This is their attempt to corrupt us, Sato told his men, holding up the chocolate bar, to make us soft like they are, to prove that we're weak, that we can be bought with sugar. He walked to the garbage bin and with theatrical disgust threw both his chocolate bars away. Several other prisoners followed his example, tossing their chocolate unopened into the trash. Takeshi held his chocolate uncertain. Part of him agreed with the sergeant. Accepting pleasure from the enemy felt like collaboration, like surrendering more than just militarily. But another part, the part that had eaten grass and bark to survive, was curious. He'd never tasted chocolate. How could he judge it without knowing? That night, alone in his bunk, Takeshi unwrapped one of his chocolate bars. The foil crackled softly, seeming loud in the quiet barracks. He broke off a small piece and examined it. It was dark brown, smooth, with a faint smell that reminded him somehow of something comforting, though he couldn't place what. He put the piece in his mouth. The taste was unlike anything he'd experienced. Sweet, yes, but not the clean sweetness of sugar or the subtle sweetness of traditional Japanese confections. This was rich, complex, almost overwhelming. It melted on his tongue, coating his mouth with flavour that seemed to reach something deep in his brain, triggering a pleasure response he hadn't felt in years. He closed his eyes and let the chocolate dissolve completely before taking another piece. He ate the entire bar slowly, reverently, experiencing each bite fully. When he finished, he lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling, his mind reeling. This wasn't just food. This was happiness. That was the only word for it. A small, simple happiness delivered in a 2-ounce bar. And the Americans gave this to their prisoners casually, like it was nothing. The next morning, Takeshi noticed several other prisoners had similar expressions, a mixture of guilt and wonder. They'd eaten their chocolate in secret, unable to resist curiosity, and discovered something that challenged everything they'd believed. During the morning meal, whispered conversations began in Japanese. "Did you try it?" "Yes, I couldn't help it." I don't have words." They give this to prisoners, to us. If prisoners eat chocolate, what do their soldiers eat? What do their civilians eat? The questions multiplied. Japan's civilian population had been on starvation rations since 1944. Sugar had been unavailable to ordinary people for years, redirected entirely to military use, and even then scarce. The idea that Americans had enough sugar to make candy, to give away to prisoners, was incomprehensible within the framework of Japanese wartime experience. Over the following weeks, chocolate became a currency, an obsession, and ultimately a philosophical crisis for the Japanese prisoners. The Americans distributed chocolate regularly, sometimes as part of standard rations, sometimes as rewards for work details, sometimes just casually, the way someone might share cigarettes. They treated it as commonplace, unremarkable, abundant. The prisoners began trading for chocolate. Men who didn't smoke offered their cigarette rations for extra chocolate bars. Those assigned to kitchen duty tried to befriend American guards who might share their personal stash. Some prisoners, overcome with craving, asked the American interpreters where chocolate came from, how it was made, whether Japan had any. Private Kenji Matsuda, a former schoolteacher from Kyoto, became fascinated by the logistics of chocolate. Through halting conversations with American guards and interpreters, he learned facts that shook his worldview. America produced hundreds of millions of chocolate bars during the war. The Hershey factory alone made 500,000 bars per day for military rations. Chocolate wasn't a luxury reserved for elites. It was mass-produced, democratized, available to common soldiers and now even to prisoners. Kenji did calculations in a notebook, trying to understand the industrial capacity this implied. To produce that much chocolate required vast sugar supplies, imported cocoa beans from overseas, which meant functioning global trade networks even during war, mechanized factories running constantly, transportation networks to distribute the finished product, and surplus resources beyond immediate military necessity. "They're fighting a total war across 2 oceans, Kenji told Takeshi one evening, his notebook open between them. "They're building thousands of ships and planes, equipping millions of soldiers, and they still have enough industrial capacity left over to mass-produce candy bars. We were told America was weak, wasteful, stretched to breaking. But a nation that can give chocolate to its enemies isn't weak. It's operating on a level we never reached." The chocolate became a symbol of a larger truth the prisoners were slowly, reluctantly absorbing. Everything they'd been told about America was wrong. Not just wrong, but inverted. They'd been taught that Japanese strength came from deprivation, from sacrifice, from accepting hardship without complaint. American softness, American love of comfort and pleasure, was supposed to be weakness. But the chocolate told a different story, it said. "We have so much that we can afford pleasure. We're so productive that we can make candy while fighting a global war. We're so confident in our strength that we can give sweets to our enemies without fear it will somehow weaken us." Sergeant Sato, who'd thrown his chocolate away in disgust, eventually broke. Takeshi saw it happen. They were on a work detail, helping to process supplies, when Sato found a broken chocolate bar among some damaged rations. He looked around to make sure no one was watching, picked up a piece and ate it. His expression as the chocolate melted on his tongue was one of profound defeat, not to America, but to his own body's truth. It was delicious. It made him feel good, and no amount of military discipline could make those facts untrue. That evening, Sato gathered his men and delivered a speech that marked a turning point. "I was wrong," he said simply in Japanese, "about the chocolate, about the food, about the Americans. I believed what we were told, that they were weak, that their comfort made them soft, that our hardship made us strong. But strength isn't choosing to suffer when abundance is possible. That's just waste. America didn't defeat us because we were too hard and they were too soft. They defeated us because they could be comfortable and strong. They could eat chocolate and build an empire of machines. We mistook their abundance for weakness, and it cost us everything." The speech electrified the prisoners. For the first time, someone with authority, a sergeant who'd fought bravely, who couldn't be accused of cowardice, was questioning the fundamental narrative of Japanese military ideology. The conversation that followed went late into the night, prisoners debating in hushed voices what this meant, what they believed now, what they'd been fighting for. Takeshi wrote in a journal he'd started keeping, "The chocolate haunts me, not because it's chocolate, but because of what it represents. We were told to despise comfort, to embrace hardship, to find strength in suffering. But the Americans never suffered the way we did. They ate well, slept in real beds, had time for pleasure and entertainment, and they still won. They won easily. What does that say about our philosophy? Were we just starving ourselves for nothing?" The question echoed through the camp as more Japanese POWs arrived in the following months. New prisoners went through the same cycle: disbelief at the food, resistance born from propaganda, gradual acceptance, and then the chocolate. Always the chocolate that broke through the last psychological defenses. A prisoner named Yoshio Nakamura, a naval officer captured when his ship was sunk, experienced the transformation with particular intensity. He'd been trained at the Naval Academy, indoctrinated deeply in Bushido, the warrior code that prized honor over life. He arrived at Camp McCoy in December 1945, expecting death and finding chocolate instead. For 2 weeks, Yoshio refused all American food, surviving on minimal rice and water. He was prepared to starve himself to death rather than accept comfort from the enemy. But then Christmas came, and the Americans, in what seemed like psychological warfare disguised as kindness, gave each prisoner a gift package. Inside Yoshio's was a wool scarf, a pair of socks, a book of photographs showing American landscapes, and 6 chocolate bars, more chocolate than he'd ever seen in one place. He stared at the chocolate for 3 days. It sat on his bunk, wrapped neatly, a physical manifestation of everything he despised about American culture. Excess, indulgence, weakness, masquerading as generosity. He would not eat it. He would not be bought with sugar. On the 4th day, weak from self-imposed starvation, Yoshio opened 1 bar. Just to see it, he told himself, not to eat it. He broke off a piece and held it to his nose, smelling the rich cocoa scent. And then, almost involuntarily, his body took over. He put the piece in his mouth. The pleasure was so intense it brought tears to his eyes. Not just the taste, though, that was extraordinary, but the feeling of his body receiving something good, something purely enjoyable without suffering or hardship attached. For years, every pleasure had been rationed, controlled, justified only by its contribution to the war effort. This was pleasure for its own sake, given freely, without expectation or obligation. Yoshio ate all 6 chocolate bars that night, and then he wept, for the lies he'd believed, for the years wasted in deprivation, for the friends who'd died still believing that suffering was virtue. The chocolate had cracked something fundamental in his worldview, and he couldn't put it back together. The psychological transformation rippled through the POW population. The Americans, recognizing the effect, made chocolate a regular part of rations. They also brought in Japanese-American soldiers to talk with the prisoners about life in America, about Japanese communities in California and Hawaii, about how people could maintain cultural identity while embracing American abundance. One such soldier, Sergeant Roy Nakamura, no relation to Yoshio, visited Camp McCoy in early 1946. Roy's parents had immigrated from Hiroshima in the 1920s. He'd grown up eating Japanese food at home, speaking Japanese with his family, but also eating hamburgers, playing baseball, and living the American dream. He'd volunteered for the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the most decorated unit in American military history, composed entirely of Japanese Americans fighting to prove their loyalty, while their families were held in internment camps. Roy sat with a group of POWs and answered their questions. They asked about prejudice, about discrimination, about whether Japanese could really succeed in America. Roy was honest about the challenges. Yes, there was prejudice. Yes, his family had been interned unjustly. Yes, Japanese Americans had to work twice as hard to be seen as equal. But here's what's also true, Roy said, unwrapping a chocolate bar and taking a bite. My father owns a farm in California. He came with nothing, worked for years, saved everything and bought land. His farm produces more food than his entire village in Japan produced before he left. He has machines, electricity, running water, a truck, a telephone. My younger brother is in college, studying to be an engineer. My sister is a teacher. We eat chocolate whenever we want. We have opportunity, freedom, the chance to build something that's real too. The prisoners listened intently. One asked, "But you said your family was in internment camps. How can you fight for a country that did that to you?" Roy thought for a moment. Because even at its worst, even when it was scared and wrong, America gave us due process. They put us in camps, yes, but they didn't execute us, didn't starve us, didn't strip us of our fundamental humanity. And good Americans fought against it, spoke out against it, worked to make it right. That's the difference. In America, the system can be wrong, but it can also correct itself. There's space for criticism, for change, for being better. That's worth fighting for. He offered the prisoners chocolate bars from his pack. This chocolate, Hershey's factory is in Pennsylvania. They hired whoever could do the work. Men, women, immigrants, different races working side by side, not because they were forced to, but because efficient production requires using everyone's talents. That's American strength, not just machines, but the idea that anyone can contribute, anyone can succeed, anyone can eat chocolate. The conversation went for hours. By the end, prisoners were asking how they could learn more about America, about democracy, about the system that produced such abundance. The chocolate had been the catalyst, but the transformation ran deeper, from rejecting Western culture as corrupt to wondering if Japanese culture might benefit from some Western ideas, from viewing comfort as weakness to understanding that unnecessary suffering was waste. By mid-1946, the educational programs at POW camps had become intense. Japanese prisoners studied English, American history, democratic principles, and modern agricultural and industrial techniques. The goal was repatriation, sending them home to help rebuild Japan as a democratic nation, aligned with the West rather than returning to militarism. Takeshi enrolled in every class available. He studied English voraciously, practiced with American guards, and absorbed information about American farming methods, industrial production, and political systems. He also developed a particular fascination with food production, especially chocolate manufacturing. He wrote letters to the Hershey Company asking for information about their production methods, and surprisingly, they responded with educational materials about cocoa processing, mass production, and distribution. When repatriation began in late 1946, Takeshi returned to Japan carrying an English-Japanese dictionary, 3 notebooks filled with information about American agriculture and industry, a small library of books about democratic government, and a duffel bag containing 20 chocolate bars, his saved rations plus bars given by American guards as farewell gifts. He returned to a devastated Japan. Tokyo was ruins. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were shadows of cities, still radioactive, still counting their dead. The countryside was impoverished, farms destroyed, infrastructure shattered. People were hungry, genuinely hungry, surviving on 800 calories a day from relief supplies. Sugar was unobtainable. Chocolate was a fantasy from before the war. Takeshi shared his chocolate with his family, his mother, his sister, his young nephew who'd never tasted anything sweet. He watched their faces as they experienced chocolate for the first time, saw the same wonder he'd felt, and explained what he'd learned. This isn't just candy. This is proof of what a society can achieve when it's organized efficiently, when it values productivity over sacrifice, when it allows freedom and innovation. Japan needs to learn these lessons. He became an advocate for democratic reforms, working with American occupation authorities to help rebuild Japanese agriculture using mechanized techniques he'd observed in America. He taught farmers about crop rotation, fertilizers, and efficient irrigation, knowledge he'd gained from work details and educational programs in the POW camp. His village's rice production doubled within 3 years. Sergeant Sato returned to Japan and opened a small confectionery shop in Osaka. He couldn't get real chocolate. Cocoa beans were impossible to import and sugar remained scarce. But he made traditional Japanese sweets using modern production techniques he'd learned from watching American efficiency. His shop became successful, and by the early 1950s, when trade relationships normalized, he became one of the first Japanese importers of American chocolate, selling Hershey bars in Osaka as symbols of the new relationship between former enemies. Kenji Matsuda, the schoolteacher, returned to Kyoto and became a professor of American studies at Doshisha University. He taught classes on American culture, economics, and industrial production, using chocolate as a case study in how American capitalism functioned. The chocolate bar represents everything about American system, he'd tell students. Mass production, efficient distribution, democratic access, not reserved for elites but available to everyone, even prisoners. That's the American miracle we need to understand. Yoshio Nakamura, the naval officer who'd wept over chocolate, had perhaps the most profound transformation. He renounced his military career and became a Buddhist monk, dedicating his life to peace activism. But he never forgot the chocolate. In his temple in Kyoto, he kept a Hershey bar wrapper under glass, not as a relic of America, but as a reminder of the moment his worldview cracked open. I was taught that suffering was noble, that hardship built character, that pleasure was weakness, he'd tell visitors to his temple. The chocolate taught me that this was a lie. Unnecessary suffering isn't noble, it's waste. True strength comes from building a society abundant enough that everyone can have small pleasures, simple joys. The Americans understood this. We didn't. That's why we lost, and that's what we must learn. By the 1950s, as Japan rebuilt under American occupation and guidance, chocolate became a symbol of the new Japan. Morinaga, Meiji, and other Japanese companies began producing chocolate domestically, using techniques learned from American manufacturers. Chocolate became associated with modernity, with prosperity, with the new democratic Japan that was rising from the ashes of the old militaristic empire. Former POWs who tasted American chocolate in prison camps became evangelists for it. They introduced their children to chocolate, explaining that this simple sweet had taught them more about America than any propaganda could. The generation born after the war grew up with chocolate as normal, ordinary, available, a stark contrast to their parents' experience of sugar as an almost mythical substance. In 1965, 20 years after the war ended, a reunion was held in Tokyo for former Japanese POWs who'd been held at American camps. Over 300 men attended, including Takeshi, Sato, Kenji, and Yoshio. The organizers, with intentional symbolism, served chocolate cake at the reception. Takeshi stood to speak, now in his 40s, successful farmer and community leader. 20 years ago, he said in Japanese, I threw chocolate in the garbage. I called it a Western perversion, evidence of American moral weakness. I was a fool. That chocolate and the Americans who gave it to us taught me that strength and comfort are not opposites. That a society can be both prosperous and powerful. That pleasure is not weakness. Unnecessary suffering is weakness. He held up a Hershey bar, the same brand he'd first tasted in 1945. This chocolate bar changed my life more than any battle, any weapon, any ideology. It showed me that everything I'd been taught was wrong. And I'm grateful for it. Grateful to have been wrong, grateful to have learned, grateful to have survived to taste chocolate and understand what it meant. The room erupted in applause. Sato stood and raised his own chocolate bar in a toast. To the chocolate that defeated us more completely than any bomb, he called out. Everyone laughed, raised their chocolate and ate together. Former enemies of America, now friends, bound by the memory of discovering truth wrapped in foil. Did you know that today Japan is one of the world's largest consumers of chocolate per capita? That Japanese chocolatiers are considered among the finest in the world, creating delicate confections that blend traditional Japanese aesthetics with techniques learned from Western methods? That Valentine's Day in Japan centers entirely around giving chocolate, a tradition that began in the 1950s as Japan embraced Western customs. The legacy of those Japanese POWs who mocked chocolate and then couldn't get enough of it lives on in every Japanese chocolate shop, in every Valentine's gift, in every child eating a chocolate bar without thinking about the history behind it. They learned what the Italians learned, what the Germans learned. Abundance isn't weakness. Comfort isn't corruption. Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a bomb or a bullet. It's a simple piece of chocolate that makes you question everything you thought you knew. The Japanese soldiers who threw chocolate in the garbage and then traded everything for one more bar learned a profound truth. Ideology cannot defeat taste. Propaganda cannot override the body's response to sweetness. And a nation that can give chocolate to its enemies has already won. Not just the war, but the peace that follows.